And I think we'll get started. So we are recording the session today. So we will share with you a copy of the slides that we're going to go through, and we'll send you a link to the recording, which will be available on our public YouTube channel, so you can refer back to it if you want to. It's probably worth noting that obviously it's a bit of a sort of moving feast when it comes to the reforms. There's a lot of the detail yet to be decided by the Department for Education, Skills England, and Ofqual. So what we will do is we will commit to rerunning kind of these sorts of sessions over the coming weeks and months, as and when more of the policy detail emerges, just so that we're all on the same page and we're sharing with you the intel and information that we get in a timely fashion. So everybody other than kind of my colleague Alison and I, everybody's microphones will be automatically turned off and cameras turned off. And that's really just to make the session manageable and make sure that we've got enough sort of bandwidth as well for a reliable connection. But please do use the Q&A function to post any questions that you've got throughout the session. The comments are disabled, other than for Alison and I, because we're going to share a link with you to a survey towards the end. But any questions that you've got, please pop them in the Q&A section, and we'll attempt to pick those up as we go through, and hopefully we'll have the time left at the end as well to answer any. There is the facility to what's the word? To like or upvote is the word I'm looking for. Upvote any questions that you see in the Q&A channel. So if you see a question that you like and you'd like us to answer, or indeed if you see a question and you had a similar question, please upvote that question in the Q&A. So what we'll do is Alison and I will focus on the ones that have got the most votes, because we've got quite a lot of people in the call. I'm sure there are going to be loads of questions. We'll do our best to get through as many of them as we can, but what we want to do is make sure that we're answering the ones that are the most popular, the most pressing questions you've got. If there are any questions at the end that we haven't had time to answer, what we'll do is we'll go through those and we'll endeavour to give you written responses to those in the email that we send to you when we share with you the slide deck and the link to them. If you find yourself having any sort of technical issues as well, please just pop that in the Q&A. Alison and I are actually in the office at DSW today, so our colleague in the marketing team's keeping an eye on that, and he'll be able to support with any of those. So, very quickly, agenda-wise, we're going to just give you a bit of an overview of DSW. I know a lot of the people on the call are already familiar with us, but there are some new faces and organisations as well, which is great to see. I just wanted to give an overview of who the key stakeholders are now in terms of setting and delivering on government policy for apprenticeships, because there's been a few changes recently. Then we'll look at the changes at a glance, so at a very high level. What are the reforms? What are these assessment principles that you're probably hearing more and more about? Then we'll have a look at what some of these changes might mean in practice when the reforms begin to be implemented. We'll look at the assessment organisation's oversight of provider assessment. So I'm sure you're all familiar now with the idea that some provider assessment is potentially going to be enabled through the reforms. And we just wanted to talk through that, because I know that's going to be a point of great interest to a lot of the providers that we work with, and just build a picture of what that looks like in terms of the oversight that we would have to apply as an award org. Looking at the challenges and benefits of the reforms, and I think it's fair to say there were quite a lot that fall into each of those categories. And then the unknowns. So I think there's even colleagues that I speak to within the awarding community and clients that we work with, we'll all sit on the same webinars that are delivered by Ofqual, Department for Education, or Skills England, and we often come away with slightly different interpretations of what was said. So I think it's really important that we have clarity of what's actually yet still to be confirmed through the policy. So I wanted to put a section in there around the unknowns, so we're clear on actually some of the detail that hasn't yet been decided, that's still kind of up for debate. Then we'll talk about the next steps really for DSW and our customers, but also for us as a community of assessment bodies, providers and employers, and of course apprentices. So a little bit about DSW and specifically the two speakers that you've got today. So DSW, we've been delivering endpoint assessments since its inception, actually, which is 10 years or so now. I am Director of Apprenticeships, so I oversee DSW's endpoint assessment organisation and everything from sort of product development, quality, delivery, and I work really closely with not just our customers and not just the sort of training providers and employers that we work with, but also the wider sort of network of stakeholders. So I'm co-chair of the Federation of Awarding Bodies EPAO group. So we've got about 200 endpoint assessment organisations, as we were called, part of that group. And what that means is I've got really good links to my peers within the awarding community, and also to kind of senior officials within Department for Education, Skills England, and Ofqual. So we're very close to this detail, and involved in a lot of the discussions as the policies evolve in. So we're well informed and we're in a good position to be able to influence as well. So that's really the backdrop to my contribution to today's discussion and supporting you through the reforms that are going to be coming over the next coming weeks, months, and years, frankly, I think. Okay, so I apologise if we speak at pace, but there is a lot to get through because there's a lot of reform. I think what everybody's beginning to realise is this is more of a revolution than an evolution, and there are some significant changes coming to apprenticeship assessment. And actually, I know a lot of us are at different stages on that journey of understanding what's actually coming. So that's one of the reasons that we wanted to commit to doing further sessions after this one, but also sharing this information with you. And indeed, there are no stupid questions, so please don't feel afraid to ask anything via the Q&A, and we'll do everything we can to answer as many of them as we can. So I mentioned at the start, I wanted to just give a recap really on who are the key stakeholders now. So this doesn't include providers and employers and assessment orgs. It's really key stakeholders around setting and delivering the policy. So the skills minister kind of sits at the top of the tree, if you like, and they set the political priorities for government. And those political priorities might be things like the levelling up agenda, net zero, but also industrial strategy, and also things like delivering on parts of the economy that really need a skills boost and actually homegrown talent, and make sure that we're training people and aligning those skills to the needs of the wider economy. So underneath the skills minister, we have the Department for Education, as ever was thus, but their roles changed slightly. And under the changes that were made recently, to put it simply, I would say the Department for Education has a lot more power and authority now to kind of deliver on the minister's ambitions and priorities. So really what the department does is they set the policy framework and they set the funding for apprenticeships, and they are aligned to those political priorities that come from government. And then now iFate are gone and have been replaced by Skills England. And I think the key difference there is that iFate were an arm's length body, and they had sort of statutory powers really to sort of implement policy, whereas Skills England are more of a delivery arm of the Department for Education now. So I think that has its benefits, because what it means is that the government can decide what it wants to do, and it can do it kind of with all executive authority and quickly. But obviously the downside of that is it lacks perhaps the same degree of consultation that was required from the wider stakeholders than existed previously. So it's just important, I think, that we're aware of that sort of dynamic and who the different players are in setting policy. And of course, we have Ofqual then, so they carry out the regulation of awarding organisations, and that includes apprenticeship assessment. And apprenticeship assessment now, they get the idea of endpoint assessment out of your head, because it doesn't exist anymore. What we're talking about now are qualifications. Okay, so Ofqual are regulating us and regulating the qualifications that we deliver, and these new apprenticeship assessments fall into that bracket. We do have the Office for Students, who are kind of Ofqual's counterpart, and they do the regulation piece for integrated degree apprenticeships, but for the purposes of today's discussion, we're focusing really on Ofqual.
So yeah, I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about the the principles, sort of at a high level, sort of at a glance, and what those mean for us. So you may have heard that the assessment plans will become shorter. So we've lived in a world where we have had assessment plans that sort of 40 pages long, lots of duplication and repetition, and they were very prescriptive, almost to the point that they sort of tied our hands behind our backs when it came to delivering. So they dictated to us what the assessment methods would be, what the parameters would be for those assessments, and in a very granular detail what those KSBs and grading criteria were like. So one of the big benefits of the reforms is that we will have much shorter assessment plans. So they're talking about plans being around 2 pages long. So shorter duration apprenticeships then, so they don't actually feature in the principles, but it is a reform that was announced at the same time. Now the shorter duration comes into effect from August 2025, and the minimum duration will be reduced from 12 to 8 months for all apprenticeships. Now that is subject to a legislative change. DfE expect that will happen in time for the August deadline that they're aiming for. So the shorter duration will really fall into 3 categories then. So shorter by design. So some plans will be designed to be delivered in 8 months. Some will be compressed. So that means that they can be compressed and the curriculum delivered in fewer months than the suggested duration. And recognise prior learning. So where a learner has RPL, that can be taken into account if the duration shortened accordingly, as they don't need to cover that part of the curriculum. And obviously the funding claimed would then be reduced to reflect that. In all of these instances, it doesn't mean that the assessment will be any shorter. Learners will still be required to demonstrate the same competence when it comes to assessment. So then we have removal of duplication. So a major part of the reform was looking at mandated qualifications. So where they're embedded, what none of us want to see is an apprentice having to do something as part of a qualification and then be again assessed against that same thing as part of the EPA. So there's been very much focus on stripping out anything that's already been assessed as part of a qualification and making that leaner. So then we move on to employer assessed behaviours. So Skills England haven't quite defined exactly what that's going to look like, but what we do know and we're certain of is that behaviours will no longer feature in an assessment plan. Assessment plans will very much focus on skills and knowledge only. So assessment outcomes then. So we will be moving away from the situation we have now, which is a list of maybe 40 or 50 pass and distinction descriptors, and we'll be going towards a much more high level assessment outcome. Now, we were told last week by DfE and Skills England that we would expect to see no more than 6 assessment outcomes in any apprenticeship, and that's regardless of the level or the size of it. So in the next slide, we're going to have a look at what those assessment outcomes look like in practice. So in summary, there's going to be a lot more discretion for the awarding organisation. So all of the prescription has been stripped out of the assessment plans. They will contain the bare bones, and it's down to the individual awarding organisation to determine what the different assessment methods are, what the specification and the parameters for each of those methods will be. So for example, DSW may say for team leader level 3, we're going to build a portfolio and a knowledge test. Another assessment organisation might decide to take a slightly different approach and say they're going to have an interview and a project as their assessment methods. Now, provided that we can demonstrate to Ofqual that we have an assessment strategy and a rationale for those approaches, and that we've agreed those in collaboration with providers and employers, we can do that. So there's going to be a lot more flexibility there. We will also get to set the parameters for each of those assessment methods. So if we've said there's going to be a knowledge test, we might say it's going to be multiple choice. There'll be 50 questions. You need to pass 70% of them. If there's going to be an interview, we might decide that it needs to be 90 minutes long and there are 15 questions. We're also going to have the authority to determine the coverage of the knowledge and skills. So which of those assessment outcomes are going to be assessed by each of those methods. Now, the grading criteria, that's a really big change. So if we look at the foundation apprenticeships that have just been published as an example, they contain very high level criteria, which talks about the characteristics of the pass. So there's a lot more discretion there for assessment organisations to determine the the specific grade and the criteria for a pass, merit or distinction, depending on the grades that are available. So can you just have the next point, please, as well? Thank you. So on programme assessment and provider-led assessment, they're often conflated, but they're not the same thing. So in practice, all assessment under the principles is considered on programme, but assessment organisations will be able to determine when this happens. So instead of all the assessment happening at the end of an apprenticeship after the gateway, assessment can take place during the on-programme training period. And provider-led assessments will be permitted under certain circumstances, but they'll be subject to oversight from the assessment organisation. And we're going to look at those in a little bit more detail in one of the other slides and talk about what that means in practice. So this is an example that we've taken from one of the recently published foundation apprenticeships. And Skills England have told us that while the model for the new apprenticeships is not going to be identical to this, it is going to be very similar. And one thing that we do know for sure is that they're going to be using the same assessment outcome approach, as we can see here. So we think it's really positive because it does give us more discretion and our assessors more discretion to be able to say that they're convinced that that person is competent. So we have had scenarios to date, not many, but we have had some where we've got someone who's clearly competent, but they've only ticked 49 out of the 50 boxes they need to tick. And we end up having to fail them despite trying our best to look at things holistically. The reality is there's just one little bit they haven't done. So there's going to be a lot more discretion for us to be able to make informed decisions, both as assessment organisations and subject matter experts. But there's always a payoff when you've got flexibility. So the more flexibility you have, typically the less consistency that you would have and the more moderation and standardization we would need. But we do think the balance here is much better than what we had before. It was overly prescriptive. So it's a lot better now. We're going to have the discretion to design and deliver assessments that are fairer for apprentices. So what does it mean in practice then? So I think one thing that's quite difficult to get your head around at first is the thing that there is no such thing as endpoint assessment anymore. So that terminology is disappearing from all of the official documentation, and even the gateway term is now changed. So it's now called gateway to completion. So rather than the apprentice finishing the learning and going and entering an assessment window, it's more of a last step for us to claim that certificate for the apprentice. So some of this still needs to be fleshed out, and that guidance is going to come from Skills England and Ofqual, but it's quite clear that assessment can be carried out much earlier on in the programme. And that's down to us as an assessment organisation to determine what might be appropriate to do that, or where it might be appropriate to do that. So for example, health and safety might be done early on, but there is a lot more discretion for us to be able to deliver assessments while the apprentice is on programme, rather than us end loading it all and creating those bottlenecks that could be logistically challenging. So modularised assessment also looks possible under the new principles. So the nature of the assessment suggests that that could be broken down into smaller parts that are taken over a longer period of time. And that could be a single assessment or more than one assessment, providing there is no duplication of content. So in practice, it can be provider or assessment organisation assessed. Now, we do need to flesh that out a little bit more. We need some more meat on the bones, because at the moment, we don't understand whether it's mandated or there has to be some on-programme assessment or provider assessment. But what we do know is that principals are very much encouraging that. We're just going to have to think about the models that we have in place so that we can manage that in line with Ofqual's expectation. So A significant proportion of the assessment will be synoptic. Now, Ofqual have been really helpful in the consultation, and they've given us a definition of what they mean by synoptic assessment. So their definition is identify and use effectively in an integrated way an appropriate and substantial selection of knowledge and skills from the occupational standard. So it's really about integrating the knowledge and the skills and carrying out a practical assessment that holistically assesses their capability in the role. So what they don't want is one assessment that covers all of the knowledge and one that covers all of the skills. They expect there to be synoptic assessment that is a blend of both. And they've used the term significant proportion, and they've suggested in the consultation that they would expect a minimum proportion of synoptic assessment to be 40%. So when it comes to provider versus the assessment organisation marking those assessments, they would expect to see a substantial proportion of the assessment to be directly marked by the assessment organisation. And again, they've used that 40% as kind of a lower base mark. They would expect it to be higher though, unless there is a reason for it not to be. And then provider assessment has to be subject to AA oversight. And this is where it becomes more technical and slightly potentially more complicated, but we're going to have a look at that in practice on the next slide. So AO oversight, then, we think this is a real game changer when it comes to the relationship between the awarding organisation and the training provider, or the centre, if we're going to use Ofqual's terminology. So there will be those, some people on the webinar who are providers, and you may already have those types of relationships in place. So if you're delivering a qual for a UK-based awarding organisation, you're probably going to be very familiar with this because it's been Ofqual's requirement to have those centre arrangements in place for a long time. But with the move towards endpoint assessment becoming an on-programme assessment and towards elements of it being potentially delivered by the provider, it is essentially now a qualification, and therefore it will be subject to the same degree of Ofqual regulation as other types of qualifications are. So on this slide, we're going to explore what that looks like in a bit more detail. Excuse me. So there are two key documents that Ofqual are going to require assessment organisations to create. So the first one is an assessment strategy. So that's an overarching assessment strategy for the business, but then potentially we're going to have to create more granular assessment strategies for individual apprenticeships or groups of apprenticeships. That assessment strategy will basically demonstrate to Ofqual the process by which we have selected what we believe to be the most appropriate assessment methodology for each of those qualifications, so for each of those apprenticeships. We have to demonstrate that we understand the different payoffs with selecting different methods. So some methods may be more reliable than others, some may provide more valid judgment of assessment, some may just be more manageable in terms of cost and complexity. So we will have to demonstrate to Ofqual that we understand all of that and that we've applied the appropriate methodology for each of the qualifications so that it is appropriate to the subject that's being assessed and appropriate to the level, and also that we've consulted with the users of that qualification. So in the main, that would be the employers. So we have to show to Ofqual that we haven't just designed something without bothering to engage with the employers and find out if that is what they want. So the key difference here is that we've never had to do that before. So with endpoint assessment, we were given really prescriptive assessment plans that were developed with the employers. So they told us what the methods were, what the KSBs were, and what the parameters were. Now, all of that sits with the assessment organisation to design. So we need to have something in place to show that we know what we're doing and we've done it in line with our own assessment strategy. So the other key document that we would need to create is a CAS strategy. So that's a Centre Assessment Standard Scrutiny. And that's all about us having a process by which we can determine the level of risk associated with allowing centres to deliver elements of the qualification themselves. So it is about risk, and it's about our compliance with off-qual conditions. So we would need to take that on a qualification by qualification basis, and also on a centre by centre basis. And we think that's where the dynamic and the nature of the relationship shifts quite significantly. So if a provider wants to deliver elements of an assessment, our role becomes much more that of a quality assurer. So we would need to approve the provider, we'd need to look at the policies and processes, we'd need to do ongoing monitoring, and we'd need to make sure those policies and processes have been adhered to, and that any marking that's been done is fair, it's consistent, it's reliable. Now, all of that marking is going to be subject to quality assurance by us as the assessment organisation. So we will need to work with providers to determine what that looks like. So things like, do we sample assessments? Do we moderate them? And to what degree does that sample rate go up and down based on us determining the sort of the level of risk for each qualification and each provider? Ultimately, though, it's important to note when it comes to setting the assessments and designing the instruments, that is still our responsibility as the assessment organisation. But what we would need to do is make those assessments and those mark schemes available to the providers to carry out those assessments. I think it's important to note that the buck stops with us, and that's why we need those processes in place, so that if anything does go wrong, we're then in a position to demonstrate to Ofqual the things that we had in place to mitigate that and prevent it from happening. So you may be aware that Ofqual have a consultation. You may have seen that published on LinkedIn or heard that. Now that is live until the 27th of August. That consultation isn't just for awarding bodies, so anybody can go on there and fill that in. And we would encourage everybody to do that. It will probably help you to understand some of the terminology that's being used and some of the concepts that are being introduced to you, and give you further awareness of how Ofqual intend to regulate assessment organisations. So in Ofqual's consultation, they listed some specific conditions from their general conditions of recognition. And these are the ones that they think are going to be most pertinent for us as assessment organisations. So they're the ones that we need to consider when we're developing our CAS strategy and our assessment strategies. So we've listed them here, and we're not going to go into a lot of detail about them, but it's really just to help paint that picture and show you the kind of things that we'll be considering when we're working with providers and determining our appetite to allow centre assessment. So the first of the conditions is conflict of interest. So in the same way that we need to make sure our assessors don't have any conflicts of interest with the providers or their apprentices that we're currently assessing, we would require providers who are going to be delivering assessments for us to have those sorts of policies in place and to be able to prove and show us records that those policies are adhered to. The same goes for malpractice and maladministration. We'll have our own policies and processes in place. Now, we do currently expect providers to have that in place as well, but we do think there's going to be a little bit more scrutiny on those, as we're going to be responsible for the centre's enforcement of those policies. Now, the next two are really closely linked. So arrangements for third parties and centres. So basically, they are the same thing. The centre is the third party. So we're essentially devolving the responsibility for potentially marking some of the apprentices' work. And in order to do that, that's where the really detailed stuff needs to come in, which does potentially make it more complicated, not just for us, but for training providers, because there's a lot more that we will all have to adhere to in terms of the Ofqual requirements. And then next we have marking the assessment. So if you look at the conditions and what Ofqual says under these headings, and what they're reiterating throughout this is that even though we're not marking the assessment, we're as responsible for the process as we would be if we were marking those ourselves. So that's why we need to have all of these processes in place and to be approving centres on an individual basis, and then having those systems in place so we can monitor things on an ongoing basis and make sure that everything that was agreed at the beginning and up front is actually taking place. So it would all be about approval, monitoring, and that then ongoing quality assurance. And finally, we have the CAS strategy, which is basically all of the above conditions in that single strategy document that I talked about that we would then have to make available to Ofqual.
So that was really helpful. Thank you, Alison. We've got plenty of time left, actually, and there were a few questions in the Q&A. So before we move on to the next section, I think we'll attempt to answer those for you. So Linda asked a question, what does the asterisk mean on the assessment outcome example? I did have a sneaky look when I saw that question pop up. I'll be honest, Linda, I don't know without looking at the the Skills England page, but we'll check that and we'll clarify for you. It's slightly more complicated with the foundation apprenticeships because they have sort of knowledge and skills that map to multiple occupations because they're designed as a sort of broad entry. So then the idea is an apprentice to do the foundation and then move on to potentially a full fat apprenticeship, for want of a better term. But I'll check that and I'll confirm it when we share the slides and the link. So question from Rebecca: Is the new method only for starts from 1st of August, or will it apply to existing apprentices? Very good question, and that's one I was going to pick up on the next slides. But the answer to that is we don't yet know. So the transition arrangements is one of the things that Skills England is still deciding upon. They are in listening mode, so it's really encouraging actually that they're Skills England, DfE and Ofqual are all very much listening to the sector and listening to our concerns, put things in place to address them. But what we don't know is whether or not, say, as an example, if business admin is relaunched and there's a new version of the assessment plan that's one of these 2 pages that's built on these new assessment principles, we don't yet know whether or not an apprentice who's already registered and halfway through their programme on business admin will be allowed to be assessed against the new version, or if the new versions will only be available for new starts. We've asked that question several times. Skills England are still working on that, but we will obviously, as soon as we know, let you know. One thing Skills England have been indicating, which is very positive, is that they understand from a provider point of view and from an assessment organisation's point of view that actually we need a bit of lead-in time. We can't just say, okay, here's a new version of a plan, let's assess somebody against it tomorrow. These are actually very complicated products. One of the kind of rationales for introducing the principles was around reducing complexity, but I think most of the people I've spoken to from employers and providers and assessment organisations recognise that actually these are potentially more complicated because you have different stakeholders getting involved at different points throughout the journey. Skills England are alive to the risk that it poses if we just kind of flick the switch overnight and expect everybody to be on new versions. So one of the things that they're talking about currently is a bit of lead-in time. This is yet to be confirmed, but this is certainly where the discussion's headed, which would say, okay, so that new version of business admin is launched and live on Skills England website tomorrow. Then would look at a 6-month, for example, lead-in time to say, okay, the information's there. So providers, you can begin building your updated curriculum. Awarding organisations, assessment organisations, you can start building your new assessments, which is obviously going to require a higher degree of collaboration with employers and providers. And then at least it gives us that buffer to be able to kind of adjust. But the short answer to that question is we don't yet know. That Skills England are aware of the question and aware of the associated risks and working on that part of the policy. Question from Richard Cast. I think Richard might have been referring, so we've mentioned the CAST strategy a couple of times, and to be honest, when Alison and I were designing the content for this, we wanted to try and get the balance right because we don't want to bamboozle everybody with loads of technical terminology and off-call conditions and so forth. But what we did want to do is make everybody aware of the fact that actually this is a game changer in terms of that relationship. and the requirements, the additional requirements that will be on providers from their assessment org in terms of us deferring that assessment decision and then having the robust policies and processes in place to satisfy Ofqual that we remain compliant with their conditions. I'll take a couple more and then we'll continue and then pick up the rest at the end, just because I want to make sure we get through all of the content. So Mandy, I know you're still working on this, but I assume that costs will be reviewed to reflect centre assessment, EQA of centres, etc. Absolutely right, Mandy. Yeah, I think it's going to significantly change potentially the fees and the costing models and all the rest of it because it is a lot more complicated. If some of the assessment's been done by the provider, we're doing some of the assessment, but some of it's done much earlier on in the programme. It does make it more complicated. We'll work on it and we'll make it work. Broadly speaking, I think there are some challenges and benefits, which I'm going to come on to now, but I do think that the benefits actually outweigh the challenges. I think we're all in agreement that EPA was overdue a reform. It's been very clunky, it's been overly prescriptive, it's been very slow to move. So in the whole, in the room, I think that these changes are good. So I will just move on to the next slide. So challenges, okay. So added complexity for all stakeholders. So very helpfully, DFE, Skills England and Ofqual ran last week 3 public webinars and hopefully you'll have been able to attend at least one of those. So they ran one that was for the assessment community, one that was for the provider community, one that was for the employer community. We attended all of them, and the same sort of challenges and risks and concerns were flagged in all of them. And one of the main challenges and risks was this added complexity, and it's been felt by all of the different stakeholders involved in the delivery and assessment. So, like I said, it's something the department are aware of and they're live to, and they're going to work with us to try and make it as streamlined and as simple as we possibly can, because that's what these reforms were aiming to achieve in the first place. So consistency and comparability. So these sound like the same thing, they're not, they're slightly different. So I think consistency is something that has been, I would say, a fair criticism, to be honest, of endpoint assessment, of experiences of providers moving from one EPO to another, and finding that they didn't feel it was necessarily always consistent from a standardization point of view. And indeed, there was no mandate or remit for Ofqual or anybody else to run standardization of assessment orgs. So that issue's always existed. Potentially what these reforms mean is that it's slightly compounded, because if there were inconsistencies previously where you had awarding organisations assessing against the same very prescriptive assessment plan, well, actually, if we're all kind of designing our role assessments and parameters of assessments and things, it potentially makes the inconsistency challenge a greater one. And the comparability is really around, say, an employer, for example, having confidence that that assessment organisation's assessment methodology is comparable with this assessment organisations. So while we might use different assessment methods, they're all valid methods in their own right. So they are challenges that emerge out of it. But also made a really good point before, which is to say, whenever you introduce flexibility into a system, there is a compromise, and that compromise typically is things like consistency and comparability. And I think up until the point that we're at now, I would absolutely have said that these assessment plans and the approach was far too prescriptive. It was far too rigid. It needed that flexibility injected into it. So I think we should embrace that flexibility, but acknowledge the fact that the payoff is going to be potentially challenges with consistency and comparability. There's a bit of a regulatory gap, so hopefully you're aware Ofqual have launched consultation, which Alison referenced before. I would very much encourage you to, even if you don't want to submit a formal response to it, you can click through and see what the questions are, and within it, they've given some very, very helpful detail as to how they intend to regulate assessment organisations against these new kind of versions of the assessment plans. So it's really helpful content in there. So I would urge you to do that. But I think inevitably there's going to be a gap. So we're in a position now where the foundation apprenticeships are live and they use this new methodology. We've got 5 pilots that are about to go live that use the new methodology. And then DFE have set Skills England a challenge of reviewing every single assessment plan by August 2026. So you're talking about 700 plus assessment plans, all of which will need to be revised. Um, and even if we have these lead-in times, there is inevitably going to be a bit of a gap where Ofqual haven't yet caught up with the changes in terms of the way they regulate. So Ofqual's consultation at the moment is a very sort of broad policy level consultation where they're saying basically to the market, okay, this is how we interpret the changes, this is how we intend to build a framework around them. This is our opportunity to feed into that. Now the consultation doesn't close until the end of next month. Then Ofqual are going to require quite a significant amount of time to go through all of those responses and then refine the framework. Then they'll launch another consultation and a series of sort of webinars and workshops where they'll consult on the detail of that framework. So it's brilliant that we're going to have a framework, but realistically, that framework is not going to exist until, at the very earliest, I would say spring 2026. Now, between now and spring 2026, we've got foundation apprenticeships that are live. We're potentially going to have other products that are becoming live. So there's going to be a gap there where the regulation that we currently have isn't fit for purpose, for want of a better term. So it actually isn't directly linked to what we're actually assessing. Now, Ofqual are very aware of this, and they're being very helpful and pragmatic about it, I would say, and basically saying, look, in the meantime, we're expected to comply with what's in the assessment plan. So if there's a foundation one and we decide, okay, we want to assess that, and in it says, okay, there's some on-program delivery and there are bits that are delivered by the provider, we have to be able to facilitate that, and provided that we're compliant with the detail of that plan, we're okay with that. Now, a much more detailed framework of regulation is going to come, but not until early next year. So I would say spring, summer, to be honest, if we're being realistic. So the pace of reform, I think, is a challenge, and I mentioned there around sort of version control and the transition. Um, it did appear at first when this was all announced in sort of February National Apprenticeships Week that it was right, okay, there's the target, go market you sorted out. I think the more that the department and Skills England and Ofqual are engaging with stakeholders, and particularly through the pilots that they're doing at the minute, the more they're recognising that we're not just kind of stamping our feet and throwing toys out the pram. We're saying, actually, if we want the market to succeed and we want to protect all of the excellent work that we've all done in building the brand of apprenticeships and the reputation of apprenticeships, we need to slow this down to a pace where, okay, we're doing it quickly because that's a good thing, but not at the detriment of quality and not that something that encourages a race to the bottom. So again, it's a challenge, but everybody appears to be in listening mode, which is good. Updating processes and policies. So yeah, someone raised a really good question there around in the Q&A around how does the pricing work if it's done on program, and all of this is going to require fundamental changes to the contracts that assessment organisations have with providers. Obviously, the things we mentioned before, like the approval and the monitoring of quality assurance, and then also fees and pricing and payment terms. All of that is now going to have to be completely overhauled, which I think is going to be a big challenge for providers and assessment organisations. The transitional arrangements, so I mentioned before, DfE and Skills England haven't yet decided what's going to happen with learners who are already on programme. Can they transfer onto a new one? That's potentially going to throw up a challenge once that decision's made. And then finally, the dual running. So inevitably, there's going to be a period of months, if not years, where we're going to be running the old versions and assessing apprentices against the old versions of assessment plans, and then some apprentices against the new version of an assessment plan for the same apprenticeship. Dual running is going to obviously, I think, compound a lot of the challenges that we've just looked at then. So that all sounds a bit doom and gloom when you present it like that, but I will move on to the benefits because I think they're quite profound. So the proportionate assessment, this is one of the core underpinning kind of principles of the principles, if you like, is that I think a fair criticism has been thus far, why on earth would you have an apprentice who's on a program for 12 months, okay, and they've done all their learning and they're off the job, and then you put them into EPA and it's a 3 month, 4 month EPA window? That's not proportionate. And actually, the scenario Alison described before of having 50, 60, some of them 70 individual learning outcomes and criteria somebody needs to meet, it's not proportionate. So what these reforms mean is that what's assessed, how it's assessed, when it's assessed, is much more at the discretion of assessment organisations now. So the shackles are off really, and we can get rid of some of the stuff that was really holding us back before, which is brilliant. Linked to that is the discretion that we have and that our assessors now have in that scenario Alison described. If you know, you sat down, you've reviewed a portfolio, you've interviewed this apprentice, and you think they are bloody brilliant, they were really confident and articulate, but there's a technicality there that they didn't tick one of these boxes. That's, to all intents and purposes, is now eliminated with the introduction of these assessment outcomes because we're not assessing granular knowledge, skills, and behaviours anymore. We're assessing these overarching assessment outcomes. So the payoff there is okay, well, we need to make sure that we're standardising and training so that those decisions are consistent. But again, I think the payoff is the right one. I think introducing the flexibility is long overdue. So the removal of endpoint, and I think I mentioned it earlier, this is difficult to get your head around at first, but there is no such thing as endpoint assessment anymore. There's no such thing as an endpoint assessment organization. It's an apprenticeship assessment, and it's effectively an off-call regulated qualification. Okay, so there's a lot more discretion, and I think what this does is it removes the bottleneck and potentially paves the way for assessing things early on that should be assessed early on. So, for example, health and safety, and then potentially sort of making a more modular approach to the assessment, which I think is really good from a learner engagement point of view. So, more appropriate assessment methods and parameters. So, I'll be perfectly honest with everybody. Sometimes we pick up an assessment plan and we think, where on earth did this come from? Why are we getting somebody to deliver a presentation to an assessor that's going to terrify the hell out of them? And in their role, in their job, they're never going to have to do that. It's not a valid method of assessment. That's gone. Okay, so we'll now work with providers and work with apprentices and employers to say, okay, what's the best methodology for the apprentices in this job role? Now that's brilliant. That's much more effective than what we had before. And then finally, there's opportunity for true innovation. I'm going to say it for the third time. This is a revolution in apprenticeship assessment. It is not an evolution. And I think we've got ideas, but over the coming weeks and months, we really want to listen to what your ideas are, work with you to leverage the benefits and the opportunities that emerge from these reforms. Okay, so finally, I'm just going to do the unknown bit and then the next steps, and then we'll have a few minutes left for some questions as well. So the unknown, we don't know what the transition arrangements are like. We don't know whether or not learners who are on program will be able to do a new version. We don't yet know how Skills England are prioritising which standards will be developed first against the new versions. They have indicated that they're going to publish the first 50 standards within the next week or two, and then there'll be sort of tranches thereafter of sort of 200, 200. We think it's going to be based largely on volume. So the high volume ones are going to be prioritised for obvious reasons. We don't yet know the level of prescription per standard and how that's going to be determined. So what DfE Skills England have said is they expect the vast majority of apprenticeships to fall into the category of low prescription, which is basically everything that we've just described around maximum flexibility. There may be some that are higher prescription, and they would be, we suspect, in things that are higher level or very risky jobs. So if you're a level 7 nuclear safety engineer, we might say, okay, it's all done at the end and it's all done by the independent assessor, for example. We need clarification. So the principles say that there are a minimum number of assessment methods that will be specified. If you look at the published foundation apprenticeship standards, it specifies two methods, but there's also a line that's in there that's easy to miss that basically says to the assessment organisation, but if you think there needs to be an additional method, you can create one. So we need clarification over that. And then we've just discussed how the funding is going to be calculated. Now, DfE have given slightly mixed messages lately, mixed messages, if I'm honest. What they have said is in the short term, they don't intend to revise the funding bands, okay? So they're going to revise these assessment plans. The funding bands will remain unchanged. But they have also suggested that from April 2026, they will start to look at the funding bands. But that's not the priority for now. The priority for now is getting these updated and the new products live. And I'll talk very quickly through next steps so we can answer some of the questions that you've got. So off-call consultations I mentioned. I don't have a link to them on here, but if you just type in off-call citizen space, I think they call it, and they list all of their consultations on there. Conclusion of stress testing. So that's not our term, that's Skills England's term. They've picked 5 standards that they were due to review and publish in June, I think, but it's slightly been delayed because I think they're getting a lot of feedback from the employers and providers and awarding bodies involved in those pilots of saying, okay, this doesn't work, this needs fixing, this needs tweaking. They've indicated that this month they're going to launch those pilot standards, and that'll give us a much clearer indication of what the new standards are going to look like. Skills England are going to produce some general guidance, which is really for rewarding orgs, but I think it's pertinent to everyone in the community to be aware of. We don't yet know exactly what's going to be in that general guidance, but we think it's going to be a lot of the stuff that's currently in assessment plans that's going to be stripped out. That's still important information. Things like what are the occupational competence requirements for assessors? What's the policy around resits and retakes? What if somebody fails an assessment? Do we cap their grade? Are there a maximum number of times they can resit it? These are all really important things that won't be in the new assessment plans. So I think Skills England are going to have that general guidance to cover that off. So the review of all assessment plans are a hell of a job. A month ago, Skills England was saying, okay, we're going to have to do this all by August next year because that's what we were told. A couple of conversations I've had lately where it sounds like that might be slightly extended, and I've heard sort of 12 to 18 months from now mentioned, but that's still remarkably quick for such a large number of products. Funding Rules Companion Guide, so DFE, so ESFA don't exist anymore, so DFE published Funding Rules. They have indicated that they're going to also publish a companion guide which explains how the funding rules work in the context of these reforms once all of the detail we've just been discussing has been refined, agreed, and published. And then ongoing engagement. So we as an awarding organisation or an assessment organisation will be continuing our engagement with the Skills England DFE Ofqual and the work we're doing with FAB. And we'll share everything that we know in a timely fashion. And we'll run sessions like this, probably, we'll say, every 4 weeks or so, just so that we can keep you as well informed as we are. And also you can share your own insights with us. And so you can expect further support from us. And it's not just about these webinars and consultations. If you ever want to pick up the phone, you know you can do that. And Alison or myself or anyone on the team, be happy to have a chat and share with you any of our thoughts and insights. So we've got 6 minutes left for questions.
Yeah, so another question, are providers able to consult with AOs to agree on assessment methods?
Yes.
So, yeah, I think we've already mentioned that. Yeah, we will be talking to providers along with employers about those different assessment methods.
Yeah, that's something that we'll definitely do and we'll be required to do through our assessment strategy with Ofqual. So they talk in the assessment, Ofqual will talk a lot about employers and they have a specific condition relating to that, which is that, as Alison described, we need to demonstrate to Ofqual actually what we're proposing to do is desired and is by employers and is fit for purpose as a methodology. We wouldn't just speak to employers, we would do that most likely and what's more manageable is if we do that via the providers we work with, because we work with about 200 providers, but that's representing about 3,500 employers. So we can't possibly engage with all those employers anyway. So I think the way we'll do it will be reaching out to you in the provider community, bringing people together and then agreeing on an approach then that we can that's fit for purpose for everybody, really.
So the next question is one from Amy. Thank you, Amy. So this is probably the question that has been raised most across the apprenticeship community. So how will AOs Ofqual ensure fairness in assessment for all learners if AOs can stipulate their own assessment methods based on their own rationale? Could this cause conflict across AOs for centres?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Amy, and it's one that's come up. You wouldn't be surprised in every engagement that we've had in the assessment community, but actually it's been flagged, quite rightly so, by providers and even by employers in all of those sessions. So Ofqual's kind of official response to that is, don't worry, we'll have guardrails in place. But the reality is I think the approach that Ofqual will have to take to this is the same as the approach they take to regulating qualifications, to be fair, which is upfront, individually as assessment orgs, we just need to say, right, this is our approach to assessment, this is our rationale for it, this is who we've consulted with. Then the assumption is that's a fit for purpose assessment, and if Paul will audit us against that. But the reality is we will end up, it's very likely in a situation where you have different offerings and different approaches to assessment by different organisations. that's just something we have to accept. Because I don't think the skills minister or the department are going to backtrack on it and just do the best that we can to work in that environment.
We have time for any more.
Yeah, I'm just going to pop. Oh, it's already been done. Questionnaire in there. There's a questionnaire in the chat, so if you wouldn't mind filling that in, that would really help us in terms of Alison and I creating content for future webinars for you guys. Yeah, let's pick up a couple more. Yeah, yeah.
So just lost it, but there was a question asking which part of the assessment we envisage us marking and which parts we envisage the training provider marking.
Yeah, so that I think will come out when we enter the consultation phase with the providers that we work with. So in theory, we could agree a completely different approach to, say, team leader with every provider we work with, but obviously then it becomes even more unmanageable than what we've just described. So that's why I think bringing together providers and agreeing in a collaborative way, okay, what works, and then picking the most popular method is one way of describing it. I think is the only way really of doing it in a manageable way. But I think so. So let's give an example. So say if we sat down and we had 10 providers around a table, and we said, okay, which bits of this do you think would lend themselves towards being assessed earlier on in the program? Which bits do you feel like you'd be well equipped to assess that actually um, would be a more effective, leaner, valid assessment on program? And then I suspect what will happen is it won't be you've got 10 completely different opinions. I think actually we will reach a consensus, which might be things like, okay, well, this is seasonal and this only happens in June. Well, okay, well, why don't we let the providers assess that bit and then record it and then we can sample it? So I think it's those sorts of pragmatic decisions that we would make collaboratively rather than just having an ad hoc, okay, let's just have a completely different approach for every apprentice or every provider.
Time for one more?
Yep.
Right, so last one then. So what are our expected timelines for developing our methodology to deliver the assessments?
That is a brilliant question, and the reality is we don't yet know. So I think let's have a hypothetical scenario. So let's say, okay, a new assessment plan for business admin is published tomorrow. Skills England have said, okay, you're going to have 6 months to implement that. We would immediately then reach out to the providers that we work with and invite them to a sort of consultation. Exactly what that looks like, I think, will depend really on how many providers there are. Because if there are 100, then we can't have 100 people sat around a table. So there'll be different approaches, I think, depending on the different factors. But we will move at speed with this because we have to, and we accept that, and we're building the infrastructure at the minute to be able to kind of do that and ring fence that time as and when we need to. But I think we're talking about, ideally wanting to deliver a brand new product within the space of sort of 3 or 4 months is a maximum. I think we've reached the end of the time, so apologies if you've had a question that we haven't had time to answer. But like I say, we will. I'll pick them up, and if it's a question for the community, we'll answer that when we share the slides. If it's an individual question, then we'll pick that up with the person that raised it as well. But we won't leave you hanging, so don't worry. So thanks very much for your time. I know we probably bamboozled some of you with a lot of information. We're all on a learning curve, but we are here to support you. And Alison and I, and us as an organisation, we're really excited about these changes. Yes, they're throwing up some challenges and some concerns and some risks, but it's long overdue. And it really, it feels as if we've been fighting with one arm tied behind our backs for a long time. And now we're freed up to do the things that we've been desperate to do for so long. So let's work together and make it a success. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.